He's the SVP of promotions at iHeartMedia across the entire nation. He runs some of the coolest events like iHeartMedia Jingle Ball across the entire nation, all the promotions. He's really smart, brilliant, and I've had the pleasure to work with him, so I think he'd be a really great fit for us. A lot of our members are graduating, thinking about what roles you want to go into, thinking about it's all a risk. So I think it'll be a really great fit. It's going to be an interactive talk, so get ready to talk and interact and have an opinion. Go ahead.
Thank you. Question, because I have a 30-minute version of this, I have a 45-minute version, I have a 5. How's everyone feeling tonight? Do you want to kind of just feel it out and see where we go with it? Yeah? All right, cool. So I'm going to talk about calculated risk and how I use calculated risk to kind of come up with innovation and innovative thinking for things. But first, let me talk through kind of why it's important for my role. So I work at iHeartMedia. Like Alma said, I produce everything from Jingle Ball to the iHeartRadio Music Festival, and I'm also in charge of marketing and promo for the entire country. And when you look at us on paper, we're a tier 1 media outlet, which means we reach roughly 276 million people a month. And to quantify that, if you want to keep going, Alma, this is the drill down for it, right? We're not just broadcast radio, we're events, we're podcasting, we're social media. We did an event just after Halloween and we got 5.8 billion impressions just from our social media. So I share that with you because there's a gravity to what you're doing, right? Next one, perfect, right? So strategic communication is something that you guys are very familiar with. I'm not going to get into the 4 principles and everything of that nature, but it's a skill that you have to kind of hone because you can influence a lot of people, you can move people to do things, you can get consumers to purchase, but everything you do has to kind of fall back on how are you talking with your stakeholders. And for us, those stakeholders are those 276 million people that we're hitting every month. And as we go through this, I'm going to talk to you very interactively about what my process is, right? And it's not so much about how I avoid any sort of issues within the communication or taking any risk. It's how I start to drill down and ask the questions. Like you're going to hear me talk a lot about root cause, right? What is the root cause of what you're trying to do? What are the questions that you're trying to answer? And Alma's favorite thing is framing and reframing. And we were talking about that earlier, but you're going to hear me talk about that, right? And then I'm going to introduce the brainstorming element of this a little bit. So let me kind of start with the top. When you're talking about creative thinking and innovation, it's really important to understand that there's a difference between the two of them, right? When you talk about creativity, it's how do you uncover something new? How can you think about something that's never been done before? How can you look at something in a different light? And it's not until you start to add value to the ideas that you create and start to, I guess, let's say commercialize those things, whether from a nonprofit sector or a for-profit sector. But it's not until you start to do that and start to gain mass appeal on it that you're starting to actually innovate. And thank you. When you talk about creative solutions and things, these areas right here are going to kind of be an overall thought process for us, right? Especially when it comes to framing questions, because I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's always going to come back to how are you looking at the question. If you're going to make a broad stroke statement and part of that statement inherently has risk in it, how do you work through that and how do you get to what is the portion of that that's causing some risk? And then you start to open up the floodgates and go from there. Perfect. So I have a model that I always use, and you'll see this when people talk about brainstorming, or if you're ever going to take an improv class, they'll give you a version of this. But the model for this really kind of comes to, while you're spitting out ideas, right, you have to be careful. The more novel an idea gets as you're moving through your process, the closer you are to getting to a fad. And fads can be really detrimental to your brand. They can be detrimental to your communications because you start to latch on to things, and not everything ages well. right? Let's be real, like sometimes you can be in a moment, but to start a fad or to start a moment or to, you know, trend or whatever it may be is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So there is a bit of novelty and you're cool with exploring that novelty, but don't let your whole focus be on like, oh, this is the zaniest thing that I can think of. Now, the other side of that equation is if you go way down into something that's super duper useful and it gets away from like, it's crazy, you're gonna start getting into pragmatic function and things die on the vine out here, right? So where you really wanna be on this is you wanna kind of be somewhere in here, right? You wanna be able to have enough usefulness for what you're doing, and you also wanna have a lot of that novelty to it. So it's a really fine balance, but I share this because once you come up with your ideas and your thoughts and you start getting into the idea of like, where does this fall on the risk scale? Where does this come when we talk about the questions that I'm answering? You can kind of start dropping it in here and be like, oh, man, I don't know if I want to be in that area. So that's the model that I use kind of as my baseline. Now, while you're going through this process, oh, sorry, I got the blinded button. There's two types of thinking that you have to be aware of, right? Divergent thinking is what you initially always want to start with. And divergent thinking is rapid fire, it's unique. You want to allow your team to elaborate on those things. Like if we say, hey, let's do this, we're gonna do a quick example. Like you're like, yes, let's add to this, let's let it build. Because the ideas that you spark are going to allow the people around you to like fire something else off in their mind. And when you're thinking about the risk portion of it, and Alma will tell you this, I don't think about it at all, right? Like I will just let it rip and we come back down to earth, and in a little bit I'll show you something that's got me close to being in trouble, but not really. But it's about quantity, it's about diversity, and when I talk about diversity, I mean the difference in ideas. You don't want to start like railroading yourself into it. The flip side of that is when you get into convergent thinking, right? And that's like making decisions on things, getting down to that question that I talked about, making sure what you're doing is even aligning with your objective, right? You see so many brands and so many people come out of left field with this thing and they're like, oh, this is really cool, and you're like, who are you even talking to? Like, what is your audience? How does that encapsulate your brand? And that's a big part of strategic communications, right? You want to make sure that you're talking to your audience. And when you talk about risk, you want to be able to identify different segments of your audience and speak to them differently. So when you get into aligning, you're good. When you get into aligning with objectives, you want to make sure that whatever portion of your brand that you're talking about is actually aligning with the function of your audience, right? So this is what I was talking about, right? With the rule of yes and. So if we were going to start planning a party and we go around the room and I'm like, all right, Alma's, what kind of party would you like to throw?
I was gonna say quinceañera, but
all right, don't stop right there. We're throwing Alma's.
I don't understand why.
We're throwing Alma's double quinceañera party. All right, so if we start going around the room, right, and we're like, I'm going to start by being like, well, we've got to have champagne at this party, right? And someone else's, your rule of thumb should always be like, yeah, let's have champagne and let's have an ice luge. And then, of course, the drunken team, who is on the drunken lab, they know what's going on there. Right? So it's going to start snowballing into things. And every time someone says something different, it's going to spark a different thing inside you, right? So that's how you start to build and grow. And the real crux to this is that you do not want to stop someone else on your team, even as outlandish as it is, from saying or doing something, right? There's moments for that. And that'll be after you've taken all these ideas in and you start to get them on paper, right? So you can roll through. And the reason why it's so incredibly important for you to just like let things flow is because there are two things inherently ingrained in all of us, whether we like to think it or not. There's something called a negativity bias, and our brains are predispositioned to think if something is unfamiliar or uncertain to you, it is dangerous, right? It's a trigger. There's no way to do it. It's your instinct. And granted, listen to your instinct, right? But when you're doing thinking and you're going through stuff, if we're talking about Alma's quinceañera and we start talking about bringing in like, I don't know, crazy pyro, because we're doing this larger than life production. If one of you thinks like, oh man, pyro is dangerous, or I'm not sure, your brain is gonna shut that off and you're gonna shut it down. So you have to kind of remove that portion, and it takes a lot to make that stop. It's not something that happens overnight, but you have to be aware of it because you don't want that to hold you back when you're in the portion of like spitting out ideas. Then there's a thing called a cognitive bias, and this is probably more important than a negativity bias. If any of you have ever experienced a problem in your life whatsoever, big, small, does not matter, and you have found a solution to it, your brain has shortcuts for you to automatically go to how you want to answer that. And so the fireworks or the pyro that we're talking about at Alma's double quinceañera, which is going to be incredible, right? You're going to start to avoid that altogether, right? Because you have shortcuts built in your brain that will get you there faster. And these two things are really killers when you come to like the brainstorming process and like getting to how you want to formulate your message, and they will stop you from even remotely taking risks. Hands down, I've seen it a million times, but what can you do about that, right? There's a thing called a GPS, and now we're going to start getting into questions, right? The root cause of how am I going to address this thing? We'll talk about our favorite reframing in just a little bit, but the idea is, what is good about that pyro? Could we formulate some questions around it? And then once we have the question, what are some solutions? How can we start going back into what we were talking about with like divergent thinking and things of that nature? So let me show you something right here. This is a picture of a guitar note, right? Instead of saying that poor man is going to drown, it probably can't hold a tune, I would ask you to start looking at something that is as ridiculous as this, and what are the good things about this product, right? Now, I work in the music industry and the entertainment industry, so I start thinking, well, one, does it float? Is it safe? Then I go, is that guitar in tune? Can you play that guitar, right? Then from that, once I've started asking those questions and I start to feel like it's a little bit safer, I might start thinking about, okay, next year when I produce the iHeartMedia Music Festival in Las Vegas, why don't we have one of our celebrities or a musician in one of the fountains as a PR stunt, riding around and playing one of their new songs on it, right? And then I start thinking, how am I going to make Gibson pay for it, right? But that's a whole different ballgame. But that's your GPS. It's looking at something, whether it's a picture or a question, and start asking like, what's good about this? And once you know what's good about that, you're inherently going to start removing the risk from it. All those things about the questions that you were like, I don't know if we can do this is too risky. Well, what's good about the statement that you made? So we can rip to the next one. This is my favorite. I want you guys to take, let's call it 20 seconds and just look at this. Absorb what you can from it. We'll have some. Could anyone give a number, even remotely, even if it's a best guess?
Roughly the half.
You're close. I don't have the answer. But that's called the framing bias, right? Your brain instinctively is going to pick up what it wants to do, right? The framing bias, and why we're going to talk about reframing in a second, is if I tell you what to be looking for in that picture, you're automatically going to start zoning in on it, right? So when you don't have any context to something, when you're looking at a new problem, when you're having different thoughts about like the risk, it's really important to go to the question, because without that question, without me asking how many blue suits are there, your brain is going to have no way to get you to an answer. You're going to find no safe ground in any of this. Cool. So now, let's go back, right? And how many blue suits are there? Or wearing blue? And I don't know the answer, so we can look. But I'm sure it's a lot, right? So what do you do when you come across a framing bias? When you are looking at a question and you're just kind of stuck on that one thing that your brain's telling you to do. The very first thing, and again, I know it's your absolute favorite, right? Reframe. Reframe the problem, reframe the challenge, reframe the question. And there's ways to go about reframing the question. You might say to yourself, like, Alma comes to me, she's like, we gotta sell more hot sauce, right? How are we gonna sell more hot sauce? And everyone kind of comes together and they're like, oh geez, I don't really know. Well, what if you start replacing some of those words in there, right? What if it's not about selling? What if it's how can we introduce more hot sauce to people? Or how can we discount a honey substitute to give to consumers? Those little things in changing the question are going to help you reframe it. And now all the negativity and all of the items that you're starting to be like, oh man, there's too much risk involved in this. You can start eliminating those things. And it's as simple as posing the question that you want people to have answered. That's why it's so important when we talk about like the blue suits, right? You are being told to look for a blue suit. If I'm coming out from a communication standpoint and I'm automatically saying to you, like, this is going to be bad, you've told people that it's going to be bad. So how can you position it? How can you rework it? How can you reframe it, right? And this is kind of a good question etiquette. That's a little blurry. But what it really means is when you get to the right question, it's got to be single-minded. It's got to address real needs that you have and real needs that you're trying to communicate with people, right? On any sort of level. You don't want to put any sort of answer in your question because, again, you're starting to lead people. You're starting to give them. Now, we could do a whole nother session on marketing where you give people the answer and you're kind of being a jerk about it, right? But that's not what we're trying to do for this, right? You want it to be a little bit provocative, like the seductively spicy on this, right? You want it to be exciting and it should be uncharted. So I know I'm kind of blowing through that, but getting to the right question is going to allow you to remove all the doubt you have in your mind that what you're stating, how you're communicating something, what you're telling your audience is risky at all. So, we've done all this, right? That was a lot. What do I even do with this at this point, right? Like, we've got our questions, we understand what the problem is, but what do we do with it? So if we're going to go into another example, and I wish I had known about honey, because I would have put this about honey, but let's use an appliance company, right? Historically, an appliance company does incredibly well. They've got a line of stoves that are kind of old-fashioned and they're out of date, and distributors and agents are trying to give it a fresh look and a fresh way to sell this product. So once you kind of have those items and you know what the question or you know what the mission statement is, let's start with the idea of we've got to our question, right? Instead of saying like, how do we sell more stoves? What ways can we reinvent the stove, right? That divergent thinking that I was talking to you about, a lot of ideas, and once you got a lot of ideas, screw it, 5 more, keep them going, keep them going. Avoid familiar areas. And that's going to start getting you to a spot where you've put a lot on the table. Now, I'm going to kind of blow through this last section, but these are things that you should be aware of. I understand, again, this is a lot of information, but when it comes into practice, be aware of it. There is a thing, much like the other traps that your mind has given you, and one of them is called curse of knowledge. And what that means is if you have any knowledge whatsoever about anything, you're automatically going to assume a solution for something, right? And so how do you work past curse of knowledge? You can do something like role playing. So if we're to ask a question again about how to sell more of this delicious honey, we might want to think from a role playing perspective of, go for it. Next one.
Oh.
Our good friend Will Smith. Now, you might automatically say he's going to slap someone if they don't buy the honey, but that's not. You want to start thinking about like how would Will Smith sell more honey, and it doesn't have to be Will Smith. It can literally be anybody you want to put in this. But when you do that role-playing exercise, it makes you start thinking how someone else may think. Which also, if you want to really deep dive on it, you did your consumer profiles, right? How do you take that 30-year-old woman who's going to buy honey, and how would she go about purchasing more honey? And if you have a large enough spread of your consumer profiles, you can start doing that for everybody, right? I was talking earlier about knowing your audience, speaking to your audience. That's going to be a way to help you get past that. And each segment of your audience is going to have a different risk threshold, right? If you have a younger end of your demo, inherently they're going to probably be a little bit more open to taking risk. An older end of your demo, all of those things in your consumer profile will help you dictate this. So what else can we do with cursive knowledge? This is the one I use the most. This is the one I was talking about. I almost got in trouble, but I haven't yet. I like to start throwing out ideas that are going to get me fired. Like, I just will throw, like, I don't even know if it's appropriate, but if we're going into like how to throw your wonderful double quinceanera again, like what if I start with the idea of we're going to have a very incredibly provocative burlesque show, right? And I automatically know that that's going to be an issue. So we throw that out in the universe and someone adds on. And we're like, oh, that's kind of messed up, but all right, now what if we start pulling that back and we just have, you know, people who may be doing X, Y, and Z, right? That idea of what's going to get you fired, and you can hit the next one, is going to really help you to expand your mind, because we all kind of have this kind of twisted side to us, whether we like to believe it or not. Right? So when you're doing the get fired ideas, they should be illegal, they should be immoral, it should cost you millions and millions of dollars, it should be absolutely impossible. But what it's doing is it's giving you the spark of something, right? So if you keep going on this, again, that cursive knowledge, because we automatically begin to assume solutions, there's another process you can call smash assumption, and that really means you don't know shit, right? Everything you think you know, you have to assume that you don't really know that. So you can keep going. Again, I talked through this. You write down your ideas, and if there's something that you assume you already know something about, take it right out of there. So when you go through the process of your ideas, again, think about role playing. I highly encourage Get Fired, not because it's my favorite, but it actually really does work. And Alma can tell you some of the things I've brainstormed with her. Do your assumption smashing. And then really it's about implementing from there. If you follow this process, and you can go to the next one, and you use your GPS and you clarify and you ask for wishes and you really drill down, by the time you get to the question and how you answer that question, you inherently are going to have removed all the risk that you're going to take. And you're going to be in a safe spot. As long as you're true to your own voice, you're true to the consumers and your targeting, and you're putting something out there where you've done all the legwork and asked the questions, you're going to be in a really safe spot. And so for me, this is how I take risks when it comes to media and producing events.
Oh, okay, so as a context, right now this semester, I have my final project in our program called Capstone. And right now we're in the stage of brainstorming about, the potential strategy and tactics that we want to do for our client, for our brand. So one of the problems that we face right now is that we're stuck to find a creative tactics, but we're not sure whether this creative is just nice to have or it can be very effective. So based on our experience, how do you make sure that this crazy get fired idea that can be very creative, but at the same time it can be very effective as well?
Well, you want to make sure that you're asking the right question and that you're solving for the right thing, right? The get fired is a tactic I use, but I've already, when we were talking about the two different examples that you're working on, the hot honey, my mind starts racing into like, okay, do your KPIs change all the time? And I know I'm being more business focused in that sense, but I ask all the questions to start to narrow my funnel of what I'm trying to get at. So as long as what you're doing is going to answer something that's going to move you forward, and have that like really solidified, this is kind of where I'm trying to go, that get fired is going to naturally help you solve for it. Because if you don't get to the root of what you're trying to look for, it's going to be rapid fire. Now, what you can do is get fired way down on the food chain after you've developed things. You can use some of those different thinking tactics and start just throwing stuff out, like round table, rapid fire, nothing's off the table. It should be contained a little bit, but it should be focused on like where you're trying to go. And write them down, like have someone just sit there and scribe or do like record it, right? And then pick the top 4 or 5 that you're looking to address and start thinking, okay, this is where I'm going. This is how I want, this is what I think is going to make a difference for us. This is how we want to take our approach, or this is what we're approaching. And once you have those, you can start calling things down. And by the time you get to the point of like, you're sort of set on where you want to be, then you start applying these things about like, all right, how do I get fired when I do something with this? And then once you get that, everyone takes a breath, make sure you're maybe not recording that, and then you put it in a safe zone where you're not going to get fired. Shoot.
So my question might be a little bit detailed, but in the real meeting in your corporation, how do you allocate time between the converse thinking and the diverse thinking? Is it like half of the time for the entire meeting, or is there a cut-off period where you just, okay, we're gonna turn from the converge to the diverge, or are you just starting to narrow down the ideas until you get a final one?
I think it's dependent on how clear you are going into that meeting, right? And will tell you, sometimes it's done in 5 minutes, sometimes it's done in 3 days. It depends how much information you have, where you're starting from, and how many people you need or want to have involved in the project. So if you have a stretch of time and you really want to come out of the gate with something strong, I mean, I've done this where you spend 2 weeks just throwing stuff out there because you're still not getting to a spot where you're able to take all of those ideas and find something that's kind of sticky or malleable. And then once eventually that comes out, then you can move on to the next. So it really depends on like how much information you have. If you're talking about something client focused, you kind of know from an RFP what you're getting yourself into, and you'll start developing questions based on that, which refines things, and it makes it go a little quicker. But I mean, you and I have spent a lot of time on like, we just aren't there, this just isn't right, and sometimes when you're doing it for someone else, the goalposts move, like especially with a client, the goalposts move. So you know, you have to be aware of that, but it's really kind of like how comfortable you are. If everyone in the room is really good at it, it takes a lot less time. If you have a focus, it takes a lot less time. But again, I've done it where it's taken 5 minutes to go top to bottom, and I've done where it's taken 6 months to a year.
And it's really cool because like outside of Columbia where you get an assignment, like in an agency world or when you have a lot of people bidding for the same business, like everyone gets the same facts. It's kind of like in terms of strategy and competition. It's all about, of course, having the foundation, the thoroughness of knowledge of strategic communication, right? But then also it's about that innovative thinking, that next step. If everyone gets the same set of facts and the same set of information, how do you set yourself apart? You know, if you do X, Y, and Z to the letter, everyone can do that. But really it's about how do you set yourself apart, and how do you set yourself apart but still align with your objectives. So I like always preach, our objectives are our North Star.
Yeah.
This is what, like, we'll come up with the craziest idea, does it align with our North Star, which is our objectives? Will it get us there? And if it gets you there, and it fits within the parameters, but it's something that's innovative and no one's thought about it before, you position yourself to the client as someone of value, right? Because you're bringing something new to the table. And don't get sucked in terms of being in a box and bringing the same thing. It's really about standing out from the pack, but still, of course, you know, having the basic knowledge and the foundation of efficiency, ROI. And that's why I think iHeart is so special, because you have all the tools in your sandbox. I'm the kind of person, I want to see the board. I want every single tool I can play with. And then you take a step back, because once you have that, you can create as many things as possible. Right? It's about giving you enough access to things and you can create something new and out of the box, because that's really what moves the needle. It's about ultimately engagement. How do you engage? You know, so, you know, any more questions? Go ahead, Karen.
I have a question, because iHeartMedia clearly has done a lot of great campaigns in the past, and I'm sure that, you know, a lot of those ideas becomes reference in future discussions and brainstorming. I'm curious how you become, I guess, not bogged down or pressured by previous, you know, successes, and to still be excited or kind of have the confidence to come up with new ideas, because you're like, oh, I already hit that level of success. Can we top it? And how do you keep kind of that momentum going?
Well, that's a really good question, especially in the business that I'm in. Anything entertainment and media, like once you've done it once, like if you go to duplicate it, it's so-so. But I'm very blessed in the team that I'm surrounded with. I have a couple writing partners, and what we do is much like you would see with SNL or we go into writing rooms with a couple of us, like key stakeholders, and we do pitch and preps, right? So we go into this meeting, it's no more than 45 minutes, and you go around the table and you pitch. And if you're not hitting, you're not in the meeting. And that's not everywhere, that's not a company standard for us. It's like how we like myself and my partners operate, because we're always like, how do you push, right? And a lot of stuff, I'll be walking by a store and I see this party inside and I stop and I look and I'm like, you know what could be better about this party? And then I'll start thinking about it and I'll plug a bunch of stuff together, and then I'll be like, how can I get someone else to pay for this one? And a great example of that is, I don't know if you were there, but we do this thing every year, Z100, it's called Summer Bash, and before my time it started on like a pier, and it was great, it was cool. And I started thinking to myself, like, how do we one-up this? And so I was walking in the city one day and I looked up and the Empire State Building was like doing their light show. And I'm like, Fall Out Boy right now has an album and it's all purple. What if I shut this street down with the Empire State Building as the backdrop and do a light show to that purple and invite, like, open to the public 4,000 or 5,000 people? And I was like, I'll put that in my note. And then I went in the next day, I'm like, hey Mark, one of my coworkers was like, Mark, I have this thought, can we get Fall Out Boy? And he's like, let me make some calls. And he called me back later, he's like, hey, so we have Fall Out Boy, they're really into the idea. I'm like, fuck, now I gotta make this happen, right? So we got with Empire State Building, they're great partners of ours, we did it. But to me, it's just like, I absorb a lot of things by my surroundings, and I'm always trying to, like, how can that be done bigger and better, right? Like that guitar boat I kind of found is like, that's sort of outlandish. And what I walked you guys through on how I use that guitar boat is like exactly what I'm thinking about for next year, right? So I shared with you like a real thought process that I have. But for me, again, it's always like, that get fired sort of thing where I see something that someone's doing and I feel like it's cool or it's mundane. I'm like, how could I take that idea and get myself fired duplicating it? Like, how can I make this like something that no one else is going to do? And I feel blessed, I suppose, because that's just how my mind works, but that's honest. Like, I kind of get high by doing stuff people haven't done. Honestly, like it gives me a rush to be able to be like, hey, here's an idea, no one's ever done this. And then some of them are like waka waka, like I'm working with a station in Indy right now, and Korn, the band, is coming through town. I'm like, why don't you do a cornucopia weekend, and we'll make it like, you know, the lead singer sitting at the table and all the promo will be like him just grunting while everyone's trying to pass food around. And they're like, I think that'll work. And then we sent it to our writers and our sound guys, and it was great. But like that's just kind of how my mind works, you know.
Absolutely. It's like, to me, it's all about innovative thinking. It's about doing something that no one's ever done before. You know, if you want to leave a legacy, I think it's beyond just graduating from Columbia and beyond just like doing your job description. It's really about thinking outside of the box and being someone that is brave enough. And it starts with things like this, and it starts with a tabletop, which we're doing next. It's about having an opinion. It's about also like accepting other people's opinion, being able to understand and absorb what he's saying, but say, I'm not going to be him. Like, how can you be yourself? Like, how can I take what he's doing? I love absorbing the best from everyone else around me, and then how can I make it myself? How can I, because, people always say imitation, right? If you want to create a trend, think about the car. The car is basically the same function as it was in the 1940s, 60s, right? It's about someone seeing something and thinking about, how can I make this better? And see something that you like, imitate it in your own way, and then people will do that to you, and then in 20 years, it's something, a new product, it's innovative. But really, it's the same foundational elements, it's just your perspective of it and your interpretation. If you create that and you're bold enough, someone will take your interpretation and create something out of it. That's why for this, we're so excited about this club and the infrastructure we're building, so that you guys can take it and create your own interpretation, do something different with it, because that's innovative, right? And when you leave here and you have an innovative mindset, you don't just develop it and wake up in corporate America and you wake up with an innovative mindset. You develop it every day by walking down the street and thinking about, how would I make it better? How can I leave my own mark? How can I leave an impact? How can I leave a legacy? And when everyone tells you you can't do it, that's the best part, because then no one else has ever done it. But that's just, again, reframe. Everyone can tell you can't.
And that's the kind of, they get fired as me saying that because that's how they refer to it, but I'd be very real with you. I don't like being told I can't do something. And I don't necessarily mean personally, I mean I don't like being told this is impossible, because there's always a way to do something. I took it out of the slides because we're gonna be here for like 4 hours, but there's a triangle, and there's 4 different areas of the triangle that define different things that you do going through the process. And the square, the triangle. They're kind of triangle shaped, as I'm saying. Not important, but each one of those different areas, someone's good at. They're not good at everything in there. You just have a role that you play, and like, I could go on, but as you develop a team and know about yourself and what your strengths are, like, and when you start developing your own teams, like, if I have a deficiency in paperwork, I'm going to have someone who's incredible at paperwork on my team. If I can't like stay on track, I'm going to have someone keep on track. If I can't always build around it. So like, it's so important to have what you are and yourself and bringing that to the table that makes successful teams. And that's why I talk about my writing partners, because we're not the same person. And in fact, we probably bicker like an old married couple, but we just have different strengths and different goals.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.